Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. On most afternoons, time behaved itself in Mr. Alistair Crow's shop. It arrived when expected, departed without complaint, and repeated itself with the comforting obedience of a well-trained thing. The clocks that lined the walls ticked in careful harmony, their sounds overlapping into a steady, almost polite murmur, a sound Mr. Crow had come to associate with order. Rain tapped softly against the tall front window, blurring the outlines of the street beyond. Victorian London, seen through wet glass, had a habit of softening its edges, as though the city itself preferred not to be observed too closely on days like this. Mr. Crow did not mind the rain. Rain slowed people. Slowness brought precision. He sat at his workbench beneath a gas lamp that glowed with restrained patience, its flame neither bright nor dim, but exact. Before him lay the exposed interior of a carriage clock, its brass components arranged with the intimacy of something temporarily undone. His fingers moved with quiet confidence, guided less by sight than by familiarity. He had spent his life repairing what others assumed was broken. Most clocks, he had learned, were not broken at all. They were merely misunderstood. The bell above the door rang once. Mr. Crow did not look up immediately. Bells rang often enough, and most visitors required a moment to gather themselves from the weather before announcing their intentions. He continued his work, tightening a screw that had loosened with age rather than neglect. Only when the bell failed to ring a second time did he glance toward the entrance. A man stood just inside the doorway, holding a long parcel wrapped in dark cloth. He was not wet, despite the rain, and that detail alone drew Mr. Crow's attention. The man's coat was plain, his posture careful, as though he were uncertain whether he had arrived too early or too late. "Good afternoon," the man said, after a pause that suggested deliberation. Mr. Crow inclined his head. "Good afternoon. I was told you repair clocks." "I do," Mr. Crow replied. The man hesitated, then stepped forward and placed the parcel upon the counter. He did not remove the cloth at once. "This one," he said, "has been difficult." Mr. Crow rose from his stool and approached the counter. He did not touch the parcel yet. Years of habit had taught him that objects, like people, sometimes required a moment before revealing themselves. "How so?" he asked. The man frowned slightly. "It keeps poor time." Mr. Crow smiled faintly. "They all do." "No," the man said, shaking his head. "This one does not keep time at all. Not properly." That was unusual enough to merit attention. Mr. Crow drew back the cloth. Beneath it lay a tall, narrow clock of unfamiliar design. Its case was dark wood, polished but not ornate, and its face bore numerals worn smooth by decades of observation. At a glance, it appeared unremarkable, the sort of clock one might pass without a second thought. But Mr. Crow did not pass things without second thoughts. He studied the dial more closely. The hands were still. That alone meant nothing. Many clocks arrived at his shop, silent, exhausted from neglect or misuse. But as he reached to wind it, he felt resistance, not the expected stiffness of a tight spring, but something subtler, a refusal. He stopped. "When does it fail?" he asked. The man shifted his weight. "Not consistently." Mr. Crow looked up. "Explain." "It works," the man said carefully, "until it doesn't. Certain hours pass without acknowledgement." Mr. Crow's hand rested upon the case. "Clocks do not choose their hours." "I did not say it chose," the man replied. "Only that it does not show them." Silence settled between them. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels muffled by the rain. The shop remained otherwise unchanged, the ticking on the walls steady, obedient. Mr. Crow lifted the clock and carried it to his bench. He set it down among his tools and examined it from every angle. The workmanship was old, but deliberate. No visible damage, no crude modifications. "This will take time," he said. The man nodded. "I assumed as much. Several days." "That is acceptable." Mr. Crow hesitated, then asked, "Where did you acquire it?" The man's expression tightened. "It was not acquired. It was given." "And before that?" "I do not know." Mr. Crow nodded. He did not press further. Objects often arrived bearing gaps in their histories, and he had learned that such gaps were sometimes the most telling features of all. The man paid in advance, more than was customary, and left without another word. The bell rang once more, then fell silent. Mr. Crow stood alone with the clock. He wound it gently. The mechanism stirred, then began to move. The hands advanced with a careful confidence that pleased him. He checked the time against the clock on the wall. They aligned. For a while, all was well. It was only later, much later, as afternoon leaned imperceptibly toward evening, that Mr. Crow noticed the discrepancy. The shop clock chimed 3 times. The tall clock did not. Mr. Crow frowned and leaned closer. The hands had moved, but they had not moved far enough. He waited. The wall clock continued, its ticking unconcerned. Outside, the rain slowed, then resumed. When the shop clock chimed 4 times, the tall clock shifted suddenly, not from 3 to 4, but beyond it. It had skipped. Mr. Crow straightened. In all his years, he had repaired clocks that ran fast, clocks that lagged behind, clocks that stopped altogether. He had never seen one that simply refused to acknowledge an hour. He noted the time carefully, then he waited. Mr. Alistair Crow did not react at once. Years of working with delicate mechanisms had taught him that immediate conclusions were the enemy of accuracy. He did not accuse the clock of mischief, nor did he assume fault in his own observation. Instead, he reached for his notebook and recorded what he had seen with the same care he applied to every repair. 3 o'clock acknowledged by shop clock. Tall clock advances beyond 3 without marking it. He underlined the sentence once, then set the pencil aside. The tall clock continued to tick. Its sound was softer than the others, almost considerate, as though it were aware of its difference and wished not to draw attention to it. Mr. Crow adjusted the gas lamp and examined the mechanism again. Gears meshed smoothly. The escapement behaved as expected. There was no visible reason for refusal. He checked the wall clock once more. Time, it seemed, had resumed its agreement. Mr. Crow allowed himself a small exhalation and returned to his bench. There were other clocks to tend, other routines to maintain, and he had learned that anomalies often resolved themselves when deprived of attention. Yet something in the room had shifted. Not the arrangement of objects, nor the quality of the light, but the atmosphere, a subtle alteration, like the moment after a sound ceases when one is not entirely certain whether it has truly ended. The bell rang again. This time, Mr. Crow looked up immediately. A woman entered the shop, shaking rain from her umbrella with unnecessary force. She was middle-aged, plainly dressed, and carried herself with the mild impatience of someone accustomed to being delayed by circumstances she could not control. "Are you still open?" she asked. "I am," Mr. Crow replied. She approached the counter and glanced briefly at the tall clock on the bench. Her gaze passed over it without pause. "I need to know the time," she said. "The street clocks are inconsistent today." Mr. Crow hesitated. "Inconsistent? How?" She frowned. "I passed the clock near the market at what I thought was just after 3. When I reached the bridge, it claimed it was nearly 4. I assumed I had misjudged my pace." "And did you?" Mr. Crow asked. She shrugged. "One always does." Mr. Crow looked at the wall clock. It read 20 minutes past 4. "You are on time now," he said. She thanked him, paid for a small repair she had collected days earlier, and left without further comment. Mr. Crow watched the door close behind her. He moved to the window and looked out onto the street. Pedestrians passed as usual. A carriage waited briefly at the corner, then continued on. No one appeared confused. No one paused to consult another watch. The city had accepted the missing hour without protest. That, Mr. Crow found, unsettled him more than the clock itself. He returned to the tall clock and waited. When 5 o'clock approached, both clocks behaved as expected. The hour was marked, the transition clean and unremarkable. Mr. Crow noted this as well, careful to record not only what was strange, but what was ordinary. As evening drew nearer, he closed the shop and prepared to leave. He extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving only the light above his bench. The tall clock stood silent among its companions, its face unreadable in the dimness. Mr. Crow reached for his coat, then paused. He wound the tall clock again. The mechanism responded willingly. He set the hands back slightly, aligning them just before the half-hour, and watched. The clock resumed its motion. For several minutes, nothing unusual occurred. The hands advanced smoothly, the ticking steady. Then, without warning, the hands moved forward. Not gradually, not with acceleration. They simply appeared beyond the point they had occupied a moment before. Mr. Crow stepped back. He checked his pocket watch. It confirmed what he already suspected. The tall clock had skipped again. This time, the omission was smaller, only a portion of the hour, but the intention felt the same. Mr. Crow sat heavily on his stool. He had spent his life measuring time by what could be counted, repaired, and repeated. The idea that a clock might behave selectively, not erratically, but deliberately, unsettled something fundamental within him. He closed the notebook and stood. The clock would not reveal its nature all at once. Of that, he was certain. As he locked the shop and stepped into the street, the rain had ceased. The air felt lighter, as though the city had shrugged off a weight it did not remember carrying. Mr. Crow walked home, his mind occupied not with the hours that had passed, but with the one that had not. Somewhere between 3 and 4 o'clock, something had occurred or failed to occur, and the city had chosen not to notice. Mr. Crow, however, had noticed, and once noticed, such things rarely remain solitary. Mr. Alistair Crow woke the following morning with the peculiar sensation that he had arrived late to something he could not name. The feeling did not announce itself dramatically. There was no jolt, no panic, no urgency, only a mild but persistent impression, like entering a room after a conversation has ended and finding the chairs still warm. He dressed carefully, ate little, and left his rooms with the tall clock secured beneath his arm. The streets were already active. the previous day's rain replaced by a dull, overcast calm that suggested restraint rather than promise. His first destination was the newspaper office. It occupied a narrow building just off the main thoroughfare, its windows crowded with printed notices and yesterday's headlines. Mr. Crow entered without ceremony. He was known there not by name but by habit. Clockmakers, he had learned, were trusted in such places. They dealt in precision, and precision was a currency universally respected. He asked for the previous day's late edition. The clerk retrieved it without comment. Mr. Crow unfolded the paper and scanned the column reserved for local notices. He did not read for content at first. He read for rhythm. Events, when properly recorded, possess a certain cadence. Announcements follow occurrences. Reactions follow announcements. Causes and effects, however loosely connected, at least pretend to acknowledge one another. Between 3 and 4 o'clock, there should have been something: a delayed train, a missed appointment, a meeting adjourned late. There was nothing. The column moved from early afternoon to early evening, as though the intervening hour had been unnecessary. Mr. Crow folded the paper. "Is this complete?" he asked. The clerk looked up. "As complete as any." "No revisions?" "None worth noting." Mr. Crow nodded and left. His next stop was the Municipal Records Office, a building that gave the impression of having been constructed not to serve the public, but to outlast it. Inside, the air was dry, the shelves dense with ledgers whose spines bore years rather than titles. He requested the register for the previous day. The clerk complied. Mr. Crow leafed through the pages slowly, his finger tracing the neat lines of ink. Entries were present, dates correct, times noted with admirable consistency. Except, again, between 3 and 4. Appointments scheduled at 3 appeared concluded at 4. Transactions initiated before the hour resumed afterward, without interruption. There was no gap, no correction, no indication that anything required explanation. Mr. Crow closed the ledger. "You find what you were looking for?" the clerk asked. "I find what I expected," Mr. Crow replied, and meant neither reassurance nor complaint. He left the records office and stepped back into the street, the tall clock heavier now than it had been that morning. The city was functioning too smoothly. It occurred to Mr. Crow, then, that the absence he observed was not an error of omission, but of agreement. The clock had refused an hour, and the city, in turn, had adjusted itself to accommodate that refusal. As though this had happened before, he returned to his shop and set the clock upon the bench. He wound it, adjusted the hands, and waited. At precisely 3:15, the clock behaved impeccably. Mr. Crow watched without blinking. When the moment arrived, the hands hesitated not in motion, but in intention. They did not stop. They did not falter. They simply advanced beyond the hour with a decisiveness that bordered on confidence. Mr. Crow marked the time. Outside, the street remained unchanged. But as he listened, truly listened, he noticed something else. The sounds of the city shifted. Not louder, not quieter, thinner, as though an entire layer of activity had been quietly removed. The bell of a nearby church failed to ring. A cart that passed moments earlier did not return. Footsteps diminished. The hour was not silent. It was incomplete. Mr. Crow stepped outside. The street appeared normal, but a man he recognized, a regular customer, punctual to the point of irritation, stood at the corner, staring at his pocket watch with mild confusion. "Is your watch stopped?" Mr. Crow asked. The man frowned. "No, it simply feels behind." "Behind what?" Mr. Crow did not ask. He returned inside and closed the door. The tall clock resumed its ordinary motion as 4 o'clock approached, as though satisfied with the arrangement it had enforced. Mr. Crow sat at his bench, notebook open, pencil poised but unmoving. For the first time, he considered a possibility he had avoided until now. The clock was not defective, it was observant, and worse, it appeared to be selective. Mr. Alistair Crow did not close his shop that evening. He extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving only the gas light above his bench burning low, and sat with the tall clock positioned directly before him. The street outside had settled into its customary evening rhythm, but inside the shop, time felt provisional, as though it were waiting to be told how to proceed. Crow opened his notebook and turned back several pages. There are moments, he had learned, when observation must give way to recollection. He wrote a single question. Has this hour been refused before? The answer did not come immediately. It arrived later, in the form of a memory he had long ago categorized as insignificant. Years earlier, how many? He could no longer say with certainty. A man had come to his shop with a pocket watch that could not be set. No matter how carefully Crow adjusted it, the hands would not align with a particular time. The man had grown irritated, then unsettled, insisting that his watch was missing a part of the afternoon. Crow had dismissed the claim. He regretted that now. The following morning, Crow sought out the man. He remembered the address only vaguely, a narrow house not far from the river, occupied by those whose lives were shaped more by tide and labor than by schedules. When Crow knocked, it was answered by a woman with tired eyes and the careful politeness of someone accustomed to interruptions. "I am looking for Mr. Henslow," Crow said. The woman's expression tightened. "He passed last winter." Crow nodded. "I am sorry." She studied him briefly. "You repaired his watch once." Crow felt a quiet confirmation settle in his chest. "Yes, he said you were very precise." "I try to be." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "You may come in." Inside, the house was modest and orderly. Crow noticed at once the absence of clocks. There were none on the walls, none on the mantel, none ticking discreetly in corners. It was as though the house had chosen not to measure its days. "He did not trust time," the woman said, noticing Crow's glance. "Not after that afternoon." "What afternoon?" Crow asked. She sat opposite him and folded her hands. The one no one else remembered. She told him of a day when her husband had returned home unsettled, insisting that something had happened between 3 and 4 o'clock, something that should have changed things. He could not say what. Only that decisions had been made, words spoken, consequences set in motion. But when he asked others, she continued, they said nothing unusual had occurred. The hour, they told him, had passed quietly. "And did it?" Crow asked. She shook her head. "It passed, but it did not remain." Crow thanked her and left, the tall clock heavy beneath his arm. By the time he returned to his shop, the sky had darkened and the street lamps were being lit. He set the clock down and studied its face with renewed attention. The numerals bore subtle differences. Certain hours were more worn than others, as though they had been consulted more often or resisted more frequently. 3 o'clock was one such hour. Crow adjusted the hands and waited. When the moment came, the clock behaved as before, advancing beyond the hour with quiet resolve. This time, Crow did not look away. He listened. The ticking continued, but something beneath it, a deeper rhythm, shifted. The clock did not announce its refusal. It enacted it, as though following a rule older than the mechanism itself. Crow understood then that the clock was not emitting hours arbitrarily. It was responding. The refused hours were those in which something had occurred or attempted to occur, that the city had later agreed not to acknowledge. The clock, faithful in its own way, preserved that agreement. It did not measure time as it passed. It measured time as it was remembered. Crow closed his notebook. If this was so, then the clock did not belong to him. Nor, perhaps, did it belong to the present. It belonged to a continuity of a mission, a record of hours that had been collectively set aside. Crow extinguished the lamp and prepared to leave. As he did, the clock ticked on, untroubled. It had done its work for the day. But Crow knew now that its purpose was not complete. Not while there were still hours the city preferred not to recall. Mr. Alistair Crow began to notice the signs before he knew to look for them. They were not dramatic. The city did not announce its discomfort, nor did it resist his attention outright. Instead, it adjusted subtly, efficiently, with the practiced ease of something that had learned long ago how to proceed without explanation. Crow saw it first in the shops. A baker near the square closed his doors earlier than usual, offering no reason beyond a vague gesture at the sky. A seamstress postponed fittings she had scheduled carefully, insisting that the afternoon had slipped away. None of them mentioned a specific hour. None of them felt the need to. Time, it seemed, had become negotiable. Crow carried the tall clock with him now, wrapped carefully in cloth. He did not conceal it out of fear, but out of respect. Objects that reveal patterns, he had learned, should not be paraded. He walked the streets with purpose, but without urgency, allowing the city to unfold around him. Near the river, he paused beside a public notice board where official announcements were posted daily. The sheets were arranged neatly, dates aligned, signatures legible. Crow studied them. Between the notices issued shortly after 3 and those posted near evening, there was a discrepancy so slight it might have escaped anyone not trained to look for regularity. The spacing was wrong, not in size, but in intention, as though a notice had been removed and the remaining papers shifted to close the gap. Crow reached out and touched the board. The wood was smooth where it should have been rough. Someone had adjusted it recently. That evening, Crow visited a public house he seldom entered. It was not disreputable, merely forgettable, the sort of place where conversations lingered without becoming commitments. He ordered a modest drink and sat near the wall, listening. At first, he heard nothing of consequence. Then a man at the next table mentioned a meeting that had ended before it began. Another replied that such things happened more often than one might think. Crow leaned closer. "When?" he asked. The men glanced at him briefly, then shrugged. "Mid-afternoon," one said. "Hard to say exactly," the other laughed. Those hours never behave properly. They returned to their conversation without curiosity. Crow sat back. The phrase unsettled him more than any skipped hour. Those hours, plural. He returned to his shop late that night and set the tall clock upon the bench. He wound it carefully and waited. As 3 o'clock approached, Crow experienced a sensation he had not felt before, not anticipation, but resistance. The air in the shop felt denser, the ticking of the other clocks subdued, as though they too were aware of what was about to occur. When the hands reached the threshold of the hour, they paused, not stopped, paused, then they advanced beyond it, more decisively than before. Crow noted the time. Outside, the city responded. A carriage halted in the street and did not move again. A window across the way darkened as its occupant extinguished a lamp that had been burning moments earlier. The church bell remained silent. The hour was not merely omitted, it was avoided. Crow felt a tightening in his chest. The clock was no longer recording past agreements. It was enforcing them. He closed the notebook slowly. If the city had learned to avoid certain hours, then the clock was not merely a witness to a mission, it was a mechanism of continuation. Crow looked at the clock face, at the numerals worn smooth by decades of unacknowledged attention. "How many?" he asked aloud, though he did not expect an answer. The clock ticked on. Somewhere in the city, a decision that should have been made was quietly deferred. Somewhere else, a consequence that should have arrived was postponed indefinitely. And in Crow's shop, time continued, obedient in appearance, selective in truth. Mr. Alistair Crow did not sleep well. It was not the sort of restlessness that tosses a man from one side of the bed to the other. He slept, but lightly, as though some part of him had remained awake to listen. Each time he drifted too far, the ticking returned, not loudly, not insistently, but with the quiet persistence of something counting. By morning, he had made a decision. It was not a reckless one, nor was it brave. It was, in its own way, professional. He would correct the clock. Crow opened his shop earlier than usual. The street was nearly empty, the air cool and unsettled, as though the city itself had not quite decided how to proceed with the day. He placed the tall clock at the center of his bench and removed its case with careful precision. The mechanism revealed itself obediently. No hidden additions, no foreign alterations, no sign of sabotage. Crow frowned. He adjusted the escapement, recalibrated the balance, and applied the smallest possible correction, the kind one makes when a clock drifts by seconds rather than hours. He did not attempt to force the clock to recognize the refused hour. Instead, he aimed only to remove its capacity to skip. The work took most of the morning. When he finished, he wound the clock and set the hands deliberately, aligning them with the wall clock and his pocket watch. All three agreed. Crow stepped back and waited. As the afternoon approached, the shop filled with its usual sounds. Customers arrived, repairs were collected, the bell rang and rang again. The city appeared determined to behave. At 3:15, Crow dismissed his last visitor and locked the door. He stood alone with the clocks. The tall clock ticked. So did the others. For a moment, a dangerous moment, Crow felt a flicker of satisfaction. Then the air changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The ticking lost its harmony, not in rhythm, but in authority, as though the clocks no longer agreed on which of them was entitled to define the hour. Crow's eyes fixed on the tall clock. The hands slowed, not stopped. Slowed. Crow reached out instinctively, then withdrew his hand. He did not touch the clock. The hands reached 3:00. For the first time since the clock had entered his shop, they did not skip. They remained. Crow's breath caught. Outside, a sound rose, distant but present. Footsteps, voices, a carriage turning the corner. The city, it seemed, had noticed. Crow leaned closer. The hands trembled. Then, with a sharpness that startled him, they jumped not forward, but back. The clock rejected the correction. At that precise moment, the bell above the door rang. Crow turned. A man stood in the doorway, his expression polite but unreadable. He was dressed plainly, yet his coat bore the careful cut of someone accustomed to institutions rather than trades. "I believe," the man said, "you are interfering." Crow did not reply at once. "With what?" he asked finally. The man smiled faintly. "With continuity." Crow glanced back at the clock. The hands had resumed their motion, advancing beyond the hour as though nothing had occurred. "I repair clocks," Crow said. "That is my profession." "And this," the man replied, stepping inside, "is not a clock." Crow felt a chill settle in his chest. The man closed the door behind him gently. "There are hours," he continued, "that function best when unacknowledged. You have been attentive." Crow straightened. You know about it. The man inclined his head. We know about the effects. Who are you? Crow asked. The man hesitated, then said, A custodian. Crow laughed softly. Of time? No, the man replied. Of agreement. The clocks on the wall continued to tick, untroubled. The tall clock did the same, but Crow knew now that something fundamental had shifted. He had attempted correction, and the city had answered. The man did not sit. He remained standing just inside the doorway, as though his presence were temporary by design. Mr. Alistair Crow noticed this at once. Men who intend to stay make themselves comfortable. Men who intend to leave nothing behind. You have corrected nothing, the man said, his tone neither accusatory nor kind. You have merely reminded it that you are watching. Crow folded his hands. Then you admit it responds. It responds to attention, the man replied, as all such things do. Crow glanced at the tall clock. Its face was calm again, its hands advancing with studied normality. It skipped, he said. Then it resisted. That is more than response. A. The man considered this. Perhaps you prefer intention. I prefer explanation. You will not receive one, the man said gently. Not because you are unworthy, but because explanation implies choice. And there is none? There was, the man replied. Once. Crow waited. The man moved further into the shop now, his gaze passing over the clocks on the walls. He did not stop to examine them. They did not interest him. These hours, he said at last, were not removed. They were surrendered. Crow frowned. By whom? The man looked at him. By everyone. Crow felt the weight of the words settle between them. When a city grows, the man continued, it learns to compress itself. Decisions accumulate. Consequences overlap. Eventually, something must be allowed to pass without trace. Crow shook his head. You speak as though this were natural. It is habitual, the man replied, which is more dangerous. Crow stepped closer to the clock. And the clock? It maintains the habit. You call that maintenance? Crow said. It enforces omission. The man smiled faintly. Only when omission weakens. Crow considered this. How many hours? He asked. The man did not answer at once. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a small notebook. It was thin, unmarked, and worn not by use, but by restraint. He opened it briefly and showed Crow a page. There were no times written there, only dates. Crow recognized some of them. They were days, he remembered vaguely, days that should have carried consequence, but had somehow resolved into nothing. You see, the man said, closing the notebook, the clock does not choose hours at random. It selects those that threaten coherence. And coherence, Crow said, for whom? For the city, the man replied, for the institutions that permit it to continue without reckoning. Crow laughed. Once. And I am to accept this? No, the man said. You are to understand it. Crow looked again at the clock. And if I do not? The man's gaze sharpened. Then you will continue to notice. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels loud against the stones. The sound felt intrusive, almost inappropriate. Crow straightened. You came here to warn me. I came here to mark you, the man corrected. Those who notice cannot be unnoticed. Crow said nothing. There will be another refused hour, the man said, turning toward the door. Soon. When? Crow asked. The man paused. When it matters. He opened the door and stepped into the street. The bell rang once, then fell silent. Crow stood alone with the clocks. The tall clock ticked on, indifferent to the conversation it had inspired. Crow opened his notebook and wrote slowly, carefully, "If hours can be surrendered, who decides which ones return?" He closed the notebook. Outside, the city resumed its rhythm, but Crow knew now that the rhythm was conditional, and conditions, once recognized, have a way of expiring. After the custodian left, the shop did not immediately return to itself. The clocks continued to tick, but their sound had lost its former reassurance. What once felt like order now resembled compliance, a performance rather than a truth. Mr. Alistair Crow remained standing where he was, listening, aware that something had been set in motion without his consent. He did not pursue the man. Custodians, he understood, were not meant to be followed. They appeared only when the conditions were satisfied and vanished before questions could become demands. Crow turned his attention back to the tall clock. For the remainder of the afternoon, it behaved impeccably. Each hour was marked, each transition smooth. It did not resist, nor did it hesitate. This, Crow suspected, was intentional. That night, the city grew restless. It was not loud. No alarms rang. No crowds gathered. But the air felt unsettled, charged with a subtle expectation that lingered in doorways and corners. Crow noticed it on his walk home in the way people paused before crossing streets, in the manner conversations trailed off without resolution. Time, once again, felt provisional. Crow returned to his shop early the next morning and opened the notebook. He had begun to chart a pattern. The refused hours, when traced backward through memory and record, clustered around moments of decision. Not dramatic ones, no riots, no catastrophes, but quieter inflection points. Meetings adjourned, documents delayed, words left unsaid, moments when something might have changed. Crow marked the next potential convergence. It was approaching, just after midday. He did not know what would be refused, only that the clock and the city were preparing. Crow carried the tall clock with him into the street. This was a departure from habit. He did not normally expose delicate mechanisms to the jostle of the city, but this clock had proven itself resilient to more than movement. He walked toward the municipal quarter. The buildings there stood with practiced authority, their stone facades offering permanence in exchange for obedience. Crow paused across the street from the records office and watched. Clerks entered, messengers passed. A meeting was clearly assembling inside men arriving with folders tucked beneath their arms, expressions composed and unremarkable. Crow checked his pocket watch. The hour was nearing. He placed the tall clock carefully on a low stone wall nearby and waited. At precisely the appointed moment, the city hesitated. It was not a pause that could be photographed or announced. It manifested instead as an accumulation of near movements, a door that did not quite open, a carriage that did not quite depart, a voice that did not quite finish its sentence. Crow watched the clock. The hands slowed, not in defiance, in consideration. Crow felt a tightening in his chest. This had not happened before. The clock had always acted decisively, its refusals clean and final. Now it lingered. The custodian's words returned to him. When it matters, Crow realized then that the clock was waiting. Not for instruction, it did not obey him, but for alignment. The city, in its quiet way, was offering another surrender. Crow could step back. He could allow the hour to be refused, absorbed into a mission, and the city would continue smoother, quieter, unchanged. Or he reached out, not to correct the clock, but to steady it. His fingers rested lightly on the case. He did not adjust the mechanism. He did not interfere with the hands. He merely remained present, attentive, unwilling to look away. The clock ticked, the hands trembled. Around him, the city held its breath. Crow did not speak. He did not think. He simply stayed. Mr. Alistair Crow did not know how long he stood there. Time, in its ordinary sense, had loosened its grip. What mattered now was not duration, but presence, the simple fact of remaining when departure would have been easier. The tall clock ticked beneath his hand. Once, twice, the hands hovered at the threshold of the hour, uncertain not of their capacity, but of their permission. Crow felt the city lean. It was not a sound, nor a movement, but a collective inclination, as though thousands of small, private decisions had aligned, if only briefly, toward the possibility of continuation rather than omission. The clock moved, not abruptly, not defiantly. It advanced into the hour it had so often refused. The change was immediate. A door across the street opened fully instead of hesitating. The carriage that had lingered at the corner lurched forward, its driver snapping the reins with mild irritation. Voices resumed their sentences. A bell rang late, but undeniably present. The city did not rejoice. It adjusted. Crow withdrew his hand. The tall clock continued to mark the hour, its ticking neither louder nor softer than before. It did not protest. It did not resist. It simply proceeded. Crow exhaled slowly. For the first time since the clock had entered his life, something had occurred that could not be undone by forgetting. He lifted the clock and carried it back toward his shop. The streets felt different now, not transformed, but exposed. Details pressed themselves forward, the wear on stone steps, the expressions on faces that had learned to remain unreadable. People noticed him as he passed, not the clock, him. In the shop, Crow set the clock upon the bench and waited. The hour passed, then another. Each was marked. The clock did not skip again. As evening approached, a knock sounded at the door. Crow opened it to find the custodian standing just outside, his expression no longer neutral. "You stayed," the man said. Crow nodded. It waited. The custodian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You understand what you have done," he said. "I understand what I have allowed," Crow replied. The custodian regarded the clock. "The city will feel this. It already does. There will be consequences. There always were," Crow said. "They were merely delayed." The custodian was silent for a moment. "You have altered the habit," he said finally. "Once altered, it cannot be restored easily." Crow met his gaze. "Nor should it be," the custodian exhaled. "Then your role has changed." Crow looked down at his hands, steady, familiar. "I did not ask for a role." "No one does," the man replied. "They accept it by remaining." Outside, the city continued. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but honestly. The custodian turned toward the door. "There will be others," he said. "Other hours, other moments the city would prefer to avoid." Crow nodded. "I will be here." The man paused. "Not always." Crow smiled faintly. "Long enough." The custodian left. Crow returned to his bench and opened his notebook. He did not write the time. He did not write the date. He wrote only this: "Some hours are refused, some are surrendered, and some are allowed once someone stays." He closed the notebook and extinguished the lamp. The tall clock ticked on, not obediently, but willingly. The city did not retaliate at once. It rarely did. Immediate reaction would have betrayed intention, and intention, once visible, invites resistance. Instead, the city absorbed the allowed hour with the patience of something accustomed to adjustment. Mr. Alistair Crow felt the change the following morning. It arrived not as alarm, but as friction. His shop, usually content to receive him, felt reluctant. The key resisted the lock by the smallest degree. The door opened with a sound that lingered longer than it should have. Inside, the clocks ticked, but without harmony, each asserting itself, none yielding. Crow stood listening. Time was no longer in agreement with itself. He set the tall clock upon the bench and checked it against the wall clock and his pocket watch. All three disagreed, not dramatically, but persistently, as though each were reporting from a different version of the same morning. Crow made no correction. He had learned the danger of that. Instead, he observed. Outside, the street revealed its unease. A delivery arrived twice. A man waited for a meeting that never convened. A woman crossed the road, hesitated, then crossed back, unable to recall why she had started. The allowed hour had not restored balance. It had exposed accumulation. Crow walked the streets with the tall clock wrapped beneath his arm. People looked at him longer now, their gazes not curious but measuring. He passed the municipal quarter and felt a distinct absence there, not of activity but of authority. Inside the records office, clerks moved with exaggerated efficiency, stamping, filing, recording with unnecessary diligence. Crow watched from the doorway. "You should not be here," one of them said, though without conviction. "I am not interfering," Crow replied. "That is precisely the concern," the clerk said, then turned away. Crow returned to his shop as the afternoon approached. At 3:15, the air thickened. The tall clock ticked steadily, but Crow sensed resistance, not from the mechanism, but from the city. The walls felt closer, the sound of the street receded, the clock's hands slowed. This time, they did not hesitate. They pulled back. The hour attempted to withdraw. Crow stepped closer, his presence firm but restrained. He did not touch the clock. He did not command it. He waited. The hands trembled. Outside, the city reacted sharply. A carriage collided with a post. Voices rose in confusion. A bell rang, then stopped mid-note. Crow understood then. The city could endure omission. It could endure allowance. What it could not endure was uncertainty. Crow reached for the notebook and opened it to a blank page. He wrote as the clock struggled. "The cost is not the hour. It is the adjustment." The hands jerked forward. The hour held. The city shuddered, then steadied. Crow closed the notebook. He felt the weight of attention settle upon him, heavier now, no longer subtle. He had become a variable the city could not easily remove. Outside his shop, footsteps gathered. Not hurried, not aggressive, organized. Crow extinguished the lamp and waited in the half-light. The tall clock ticked, and somewhere beyond the walls, the city decided how much it was willing to pay to keep certain hours unremembered. The city chose subtlety. It always did, when force might draw notice. Mr. Alistair Crow discovered this not through confrontation, but through absence. On the morning after the allowed hour struggled to hold, his shop received no visitors. The bell above the door remained untouched. Deliveries passed by without stopping. Even the street itself seemed to curve away from his windows, as though reluctant to acknowledge the space he occupied. Crow stood at the center of his shop and listened. The clocks ticked, but now there were gaps between the ticks, not silences, but hesitations. Each clock appeared to be waiting for permission to continue. He opened the door and stepped outside. The street was there. The buildings stood, as they always had. And yet, Crow felt the unmistakable sensation of having arrived somewhere slightly adjacent to where he intended to be. People passed him. None greeted him. None met his gaze. It was not hostility. It was exclusion. Crow walked to the public house he had visited days before. Inside, the room was occupied, voices murmuring in low, indistinct currents. He ordered a drink and took a seat near the wall. No one joined him. No one asked a question. When he spoke, his words landed without echo, absorbed and dismissed as though they belonged to a previous conversation. Crow finished his drink and left. By afternoon, the isolation had sharpened. Notices on walls bore fresh ink but no relevance. Meetings convened and dissolved without record. The city, it seemed, had chosen to move forward around him rather than with him. Crow returned to his shop and found the custodian waiting. The man stood near the bench, his posture no longer casual. "They are closing you off," the custodian said. Crow removed his coat. "I had noticed. You should not resist this," the man continued. "Isolation is the gentlest correction the city can offer." "And after that?" Crow asked. The custodian hesitated. "Irrelevance," Crow smiled faintly. "You speak as though that were an ending." "It is," the man replied. "For most." Crow turned to the tall clock. It ticked steadily now, its rhythm clearer than any other in the room. "You warned me," Crow said. "Once." "I am warning you again," the custodian replied. "Withdraw. Allow the habit to reassert itself. The city will forgive you." Crow considered this. "And the hours?" he asked. "They will resume their silence." Crow shook his head. "They already have voices." The custodian stepped closer. "This cannot continue." "It already has," Crow replied. The man's expression tightened. "You mistake endurance for permission." Crow met his gaze. "You mistake silence for consent." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the tall clock did something it had not done before. It chimed. Once, the sound was low, measured, unmistakable. The custodian stepped back. "That hour," he said quietly, "was not meant to be heard." Crow closed his notebook. "Then," he said, "it is no longer merely allowed." The custodian looked at the clock, then at Crow. "You have crossed the boundary," he said. Crow nodded. "So has the city." The custodian turned toward the door. "There will be consequences," he said, not as a warning, but as an acknowledgement. Crow remained at his bench as the man left. Outside, the city continued its careful avoidance. Inside, the tall clock ticked on, no longer maintaining habit, no longer merely enforcing a mission. It was choosing. The correction did not announce itself. It never did. Mr. Alistair Crow felt it first as a thinning not of air, but of relevance. Objects in his shop seemed less inclined to assert their presence. The clocks ticked, yet their sound no longer filled the space. It was as though the room had become an afterthought in the city's larger design. By midday, the street beyond his window had altered, not visibly, functionally. Crow watched as a carriage slowed before his shop, hesitated, then continued on. A man approached the door, paused, consulted no watch at all, and turned away. The city had not erased him. It had reclassified him. Crow turned to the tall clock. It stood upright, unremarkable in appearance, its face calm. Yet something about it had changed. The hands no longer moved with the assurance of habit. Each minute advanced with deliberation, as though the clock were now counting something other than time. Crow opened his notebook. He had begun to suspect the nature of the city's next correction. It would not remove the clock. It would remove him. Crow had learned enough to recognize the pattern. When a mission threatened coherence, the city did not destroy the source. It dissolved the context. A man without appointments, a shop without visitors, a name without reference, an hour without witness. Crow closed the notebook and placed it beneath the bench. Outside, footsteps approached, not hurried, not coordinated, but purposeful. Crow did not turn toward the door when it opened. He did not need to. "You are becoming inefficient," said the custodian. Crow faced him calmly. "So is the city." The man entered, closing the door behind him with care. "They have scheduled a removal." Crow nodded. "I expected as much." "You misunderstand," the custodian said. "Not yours." Crow's eyes moved to the tall clock. "They intend to neutralize the reference point," the man continued. "The clock will be relocated, disassembled, reassigned. "And the hours it has marked?" Crow asked. "They will revert to silence." Crow considered this. "And what of me?" he asked. The custodian hesitated. "You will persist, but without leverage." Crow smiled faintly. "You are afraid." The man did not deny it. "The clock is no longer compliant," he said. "It is aligned." Crow stepped closer to the bench. "Then it must remain." The custodian shook his head. "You cannot prevent this." Crow looked at the clock. He did not touch it. He spoke. "If they remove you," he said quietly, "what will you mark?" The clock did not answer, but its ticking changed. Not louder, clearer. The custodian took an involuntary step back. "That sound," he said. "It is not timekeeping." "No," Crow replied. "It is memory, insisting." Outside, the city responded. A church bell rang not on the hour, but early. A clerk dropped a ledger. A voice rose in confusion somewhere down the street. The tall clock's hands slowed. They approached a familiar threshold. 3 o'clock. Crow felt the city tighten around him. This was not an hour to be allowed, nor one to be refused. This was an hour to be removed. The clock hesitated. For the first time, it did not look to the city. It looked to Crow. The men arrived without uniforms. That, Crow noticed at once, was deliberate. Uniforms invite resistance. Familiar faces, by contrast, invite compliance. The 3 men who entered his shop carried neither tools nor documents in view, yet the confidence with which they crossed the threshold betrayed preparation. The custodian stepped aside for them. "This will be brief," one of the men said. Crow remained where he was, beside the bench. "Most erasures are," he replied. The man glanced at the tall clock. "You have no authority over this object." Crow nodded. "Nor does the city." The second man approached the clock. His movements were precise, professional, the kind one associates with men accustomed to removing things that must not be missed. The clock ticked. Once, twice. The third man hesitated. "It's active." The custodian said nothing. Crow spoke instead. "It will be, so long as there is someone willing to notice." The man reached for the case. The moment his fingers brushed the wood, the clock chimed. Not once, twice. The sound filled the shop with an unexpected weight. Other clocks faltered, their ticking briefly out of alignment. Outside, the street reacted. A shout, a collision, a bell rung too late to correct itself. The men froze. "This is not safe," the second man said. "It was never meant to be," Crow replied. The first man stepped back. "Remove the witness." Crow felt the instructions settle around him, calm and impersonal. The custodian turned toward Crow. For the first time since they had met, his composure fractured. "This is the moment," he said quietly. "Step away." Crow looked at the tall clock. 3 o'clock loomed, the hour the city had marked for removal. Crow placed his hand upon the bench, not the clock. He did not interfere. He did not command. He stayed. The clock's hands slowed. The men advanced. Outside, the city held its breath. Crow spoke, his voice steady. "If this hour is removed," he said, "it will not be forgotten." The first man frowned. "That is not how this works." "No," Crow replied, "that is how it ends." The clock chimed again. Once, the hands moved into the hour. The city convulsed, not violently, but perceptibly. Windows rattled. Conversation stopped mid-word. A church bell rang, then rang again, uncertain of its own timing. The hour was happening. The men stepped back instinctively. The custodian closed his eyes. Crow felt something loosen, not triumph, not relief, but release. The weight of anticipation dissolved into consequence. The tall clock ticked on. It did not skip. It did not hesitate. It recorded. The men retreated. One by one, they left the shop without another word. The custodian lingered. "You have ensured it will be remembered," he said. Crow nodded. "That was never in doubt." "You understand what this means?" the man continued. Crow looked around his shop at the clocks, the bench, the walls that had borne witness to so many quiet hours. "I understand what it costs," he said. The custodian turned toward the door. "There will be no more isolation," he said. "No more correction." "And no more forgetting," Crow replied. The man paused, then left. Crow remained. The tall clock continued to mark the hour. Outside, the city resumed, altered, unsettled, but awake. Crow opened his notebook and wrote the final line on the page. "Some hours resist, some hours are surrendered, and some, once lived, cannot be removed." He closed the notebook. The clock ticked on. The city did not collapse. Mr. Alistair Crow had not expected it to. But expectation and knowledge are different forms of certainty, and certainty is rarely rewarded with calm. Still, the absence of catastrophe unsettled him more than its presence might have done. By evening, the streets had resumed their patterns. Carriages returned to their routes, shops reopened, lamps were lit at appropriate intervals. From a distance, one might have mistaken the day for an ordinary one, notable only for its mild disturbances, its small inconveniences, its forgettable irregularities. Up close, however, the city felt altered. Crow noticed it in the pauses. People hesitated before speaking, as though weighing not what to say, but whether the moment itself was permitted. Clerks checked the time twice before recording it. Conversations, once deferred without consequence, now lingered uncomfortably when left unfinished. The city had learned something it could not unlearn. Crow remained in his shop as dusk settled. The tall clock stood where it always had, its presence no longer contested. It did not draw attention to itself. It did not demand recognition. It simply marked the hours it had once refused calmly, precisely, without triumph. Crow wound it once. The mechanism responded willingly. That, more than anything else, told him the change was complete. Later, a visitor arrived. Not a custodian, not an official. A man Crow did not recognize, dressed plainly, his expression uncertain. "I was told," the man said, "that you might understand something." Crow gestured for him to speak. "I lost an hour once," the man continued. "Years ago, I thought it was nothing, but today, it came back." Crow nodded slowly. The man did not wait for explanation. He did not ask for validation. He thanked Crow quietly and left. Others followed. Not many, not enough to form a crowd, but enough to form a pattern. They came with memories that had never settled, with decisions that had never concluded, with consequences that had waited patiently for permission to arrive. Crow listened. He did not advise. He did not interpret. He bore witness. As night deepened, the city responded, not with resistance, but with accommodation. Records adjusted themselves, not rewritten, but clarified. Appointments rescheduled. Names returned to lists they had once slipped from. The city did not apologize. Cities rarely do. They adapt. Crow closed his shop late and walked home through streets that felt newly awake. The rain began again, lightly, washing the stones without erasing them. For the first time since the tall clock had entered his life, Crow felt no urgency. The work was no longer his to initiate, nor was it complete. At home, he opened his notebook and turned to the final page. He did not write an ending. He wrote an instruction. When the hour returns, do not look away. He closed the notebook and placed it beside the clock. Outside, the city marked another hour. It did not skip. It did not hesitate. It remembered. Mr. Alistair Crow woke before the clocks. This alone would once have unsettled him. Habit had trained his body to rise in obedience to measured sound, the gentle insistence of springs and gears, marking their authority over rest. Now he lay awake in the dimness, listening to a silence that was not empty, but complete. The city had already begun. He could feel it. Crow dressed without haste and walked to his shop through streets still damp from the night's rain. Lamps flickered as they were extinguished. A cart rolled past at an hour that would once have felt misplaced, yet now carried no confusion with it. Time, it seemed, no longer asked permission. In the shop, the tall clock stood, waiting. Crow did not approach it immediately. He lit the lamp, opened the shutters, and allowed the ordinary rituals their due. When he finally turned to the clock, he did so without expectation. It ticked. Each second followed the last without omission. Crow smiled. He wound it once more, not because it required it, but because he always had. The mechanism responded smoothly, familiarly, like a task that no longer needed supervision. Crow stepped back. For the first time since the clock had come into his possession, he felt no need to remain. He understood then what had been changing all along. The clock had never required a guardian. It had required a witness. And witnesses, once their witnessing is complete, must step aside. A knock sounded at the door. Crow opened it to find a young man standing there, uncertain but attentive. He held no parcel. He carried no clock, only a notebook tucked beneath his arm, its pages already worn by use. "I was told," the man said carefully, "that you might explain something." Crow studied him. The posture, the hesitation, the willingness to remain rather than retreat. Crow stepped aside. Inside, the young man's eyes were drawn immediately to the tall clock. He did not ask about it. He did not touch it. He listened. "It doesn't skip," the man said quietly. "No," Crow replied, "not anymore." The man hesitated. "Will it again?" Crow considered this. "Only if it must." The young man nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Crow reached for his notebook, the one that had carried questions rather than answers, and placed it on the bench. "You will not find instructions here," he said, "only reminders." The young man accepted the notebook without ceremony. Crow took his coat. He paused at the door and looked back once more at the shop, at the clocks, the bench, the tall clock that now marked its hours without resistance. The city, beyond the window, continued. Crow stepped outside. No one followed him. No hour resisted his leaving. Behind him, the tall clock ticked on not because it was compelled to, but because there was now someone willing to notice when it did not. Some hours are refused, some are surrendered, and some, once allowed to exist, no longer require protection. They only require remembrance.